So you're all very welcome. My name is Alex White, Director General here at the Institute. Great to see so many of you here bright and early, and look forward to the session. And it's really great to have Chris Stark with us this morning, who's head of the UK's Mission for Clean Power at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Chris is here today to give us a keynote address as part of the 2025 Rethink Energy series, which we at the Institute here have been running biennially with our partners, our dear partners at ESB, and just to acknowledge ESB once again for all of the work and support and collaboration that we do with them. I also want to acknowledge colleagues from the British Embassy and the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero for their help in organising today with my colleague Emma Richardson. And a particular warm welcome, if I may, to Ambassador Cara Owen, British Ambassador, on her, what I think is her first visit here to the Institute, and hope will be the first of many. It's great to see you here, Ambassador, and indeed the other members of the Diplomatic Corps, and indeed everybody who's taken the time to be with us this morning. It's terrific. As I said, it's the penultimate event in the 2025 Rethink Energy series. We're also delighted to host here at the Institute. It's a lecture series, which, as I mentioned, co-organised by the IIEA and the ESB, bringing together policymakers, industry leaders, academics, and community stakeholders to address the multifaceted challenges and opportunities presented by the energy transition. Other events in the series, by the way, can be watched. You can watch them back online on our website. And actually, the final event for this year, 2025, on the future of transport and e-mobility will take place on Wednesday, the 26th of November, just to keep an eye out for that. So as I mentioned, delighted to be joined by Chris Stark. I'm going to invite Chris Stark to the podium in a minute. He's going to speak to us for maybe around 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience, both here in the room and those of you who are watching in online. By the way, you're all very welcome too. You can join the discussion the usual way. If you're in the room, you can put up your hand, ask a question, use the Q&A function on Zoom if that's how you're participating. And as we always say, if a question occurs to you, if you're watching online, a question occurs to you, you don't have to wait until Chris stops. You can put it in on the Zoom on the Q&A function, and we'll have it there ready to go when we come to the Q&A session. And just a reminder that the presentation and the Q&A session is all on the record today. So whatever that means anymore. I think everything's on the record now. But anyway, just to make that point. Chris Stark was appointed head of the UK's Mission for Clean Power in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero in July of 2024. Previous to this, he was Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee from April 2018 for 6 years. Under his leadership, the committee recommended a UK net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, a target that is now enshrined in law. He was Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government from May 2016 to April 2018. He's also served as Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust and is currently Honorary Professor at the University of Glasgow's Centre for Public Policy, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and he's on the board of the climate charity Murmur. So, Chris, welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
And very good morning to you all. I know it's an early start, so it's great to have you here, and thank you to the Institute for hosting me. We're here in Dublin for a couple of days, and just to say, although I'm here to talk about what we're doing in the UK and in Britain particularly, I'm here to learn. So there's a lot here in Ireland that we are trying to learn from over the course of the next couple of days. So it's exciting to be here. And as Alex says, I've got a sort of longer history on this with Ireland and the island of Ireland, coming here regularly when I was at the Climate Change Committee to understand what was going on. And it's great to continue that in this new role. So I want to talk to you this morning for the next 25 minutes or so about what we're trying to do in the UK to electrify our economy. But my background is climate, and I feel in the current discussion that we often skip over the climate issues. But since we are talking today as COP30 gets going in Brazil, I thought I'd begin with some just quite sobering stats, perhaps, on where we are heading right now on climate change, this issue, which drives, of course, what we are trying to do in Britain and here in Ireland too, to decarbonise. Really important set of charts, but this is probably the most important of them, which is where we are in terms of the global surface temperature relative to where it was pre-industry. And that yellow line that you can see there is our best assessment in the scientific community of what humans have done to drive that temperature to be something getting close now to the 1.5 degrees of warming that we still talk about in climate diplomacy. And you can probably see how that has risen, particularly in the last 30, 40 years, driven by, of course, the growth of the global economy and our use of fossil fuels, along with, sadly, the loss of land to store that carbon. That is happening. I rather feel we skip over it too often. It is happening. It is what is driving extreme weather throughout the world. This is a brilliant representation of what we need to do about it from the IPCC, which is the UN's clearinghouse for the climate science, showing you global emissions and the trajectory that we need to follow to get to a temperature outcome you can see on that chart on that axis on the left there. At the moment, happy to say we are following probably somewhere in between that yellow line and red line. And that is a measure of progress, actually, from where we were just a few short years ago. We were having breakfast shortly before this. I was reflecting on the fact that if you'd been showing this chart 15 years ago, 20 years ago, perhaps, we would have been heading to something above 4 degrees centigrade of warming. We're probably heading to something, what I think clearly now, sub 3. But that little zone that you see there, I just wanted to kind of make real what that means. This is some work that was done by the UK's Met Office, looking at what a 4-degree world might look like. And this is why it's important that we keep focused on this issue of climate change. Just a few expressions of what kind of impacts we'll be having in the world as it warms. This is what we call, this is the extreme heat. This is what the wet bulb globe temperature greater than 32. What that means is the humidity and the heat is too great for you to be outside for any great length of time. Unless you live in an air-conditioned building, you can't live in this kind of temperature. So we're looking at areas of the world that are affected for more than 10 days per year by those kind of circumstances. This is drought. In that 4-degree world, you can see the parts of the world that will face severe or extreme drought. This is river flooding. This is areas where 1 million people or more are affected by river flooding. You can probably see that there. And this is wildfires. This is the one that's probably creeping towards us here in Northern Europe. More and more we see that playing out each year in the UK as a risk. And this, when we bring that together, there are lots of ways to look at this, is an expression of why we should worry about it, because those impacts happen simultaneously. And the reason I like this chart, well, I don't like it very much, one of the reasons I show this is that it's a really good expression of the impacts that we'll face in particularly places like South America and Africa. And if you couple that with what we know of where populations are growing, there's a very good match between where those impacts are coming and where we are seeing population growth that is higher than places like Western Europe. That is going to drive migration, and we are already seeing climate migration, and that in turn drives, we know, political challenges wherever that happens. That is one of the reasons we should care about this. I think we have to keep returning to the fact that the science is extremely clear on this now, and that we have to do something to arrest temperatures. And the only way that we will arrest temperature growth is by focusing on this thing, net zero. So I know net zero, certainly where I am, has taken on a different discussion, different character recently, but net zero is a scientific expression. So net zero is, for carbon dioxide at least, global net zero is just the point when temperatures stop increasing. We stop adding to the problem of increasing temperatures, and with it, the changes in the climate, the likes of what we just looked at. And although the slogan net zero is probably losing a bit of its political potency, I don't know whether that's true in Ireland today. Perhaps we'll talk about that in the questions. It's certainly true in the UK. The goal of net zero doesn't go away. So net zero is simply a scientific concept that we have to maintain in our minds the idea that we need to get to net zero globally. And if we do not, then we keep cooking the planet. So it's going to get pretty toasty on this planet until we reach that point. My goal in my career is to try and hasten that as best I can. And the job I do now is one of the ways in which we're trying to attack that in the UK at the moment. So I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing next. But this is the work that I would have done in my previous role. in the Climate Change Committee. So you will know that in the UK, we have a piece of legislation, the Climate Change Act, which requires there to be a set of legal targets for emissions out to the mid-century. This is the path that those targets present. And you can see that the historical position with territorial emissions in the UK on the left of this chart shows that we've been actually cutting emissions for a long time now, since the 1970s. So you can go back to much higher emissions, right through the last sort of 30, 40 years. The path ahead for us is the one that's shown in that purple chart. And I want to sort of come to sort of the first point I wanted to make today in this lecture is that my career to date has been based on defining that path. And it's based basically on a concept of standing in the future and looking back. So in a world where you've got legislative targets for emissions, you can stand in 2050, you can know that the country needs to reach net zero, and you ask yourself a question, what is the quickest route to achieving that? What are the things that I wish I would have done earlier? And that leads you to this highly modelled outlook of how the transition will play out. That will be true in Ireland too. It will be true in every country. And just to put some colours onto that chart, those are the legal targets that steer that path. So we call these the carbon budgets under the Climate Change Act. These are the 5-year carbon budgets. Basically, the amount of emissions that we can have over a 5-year period is set into law in the UK. It leads you to that nice, smooth purple line, which we can explore a bit more here. And my kind of main points is, it's a very nice chart, this. It's one I used to show a lot when I was at the Climate Change Committee, the rainbow chart of abatement, we called it. But basically what this chart is showing you is if you turned off climate policy today, you'd get that dotted line at the top, which is rising emissions slowly over time. The path we need to follow is the one at the bottom, and therefore the spread of colours in between is the sort of effort that you must make to get to that path. My first point to make this morning is, whilst it's wonderful to have that, it can lead you to a sort of over-specific view of what the transition looks like. And we know that transitions are often a lot more messy than this. But it does give you some truth about what needs to happen. And this morning, I'm going to talk mainly about what's in this blue box, which is the story of electrification. Electrification plus a bit of that demand reduction at the top, which actually comes through electrifying and being more efficient in our use of energy because of it. That's doing probably 70 or 80% of the job of decarbonising the UK economy over the next 20, 30 years. It will also do the same in Ireland. It will do the same across Europe. And electrification, therefore, I think, even if the path to net zero doesn't look exactly as it does on this chart, electrification is the core strategy that we need to follow as a country. And this morning, I want to talk to you about why I think it is a good strategy to follow, not just for climate reasons, but a host of other reasons too. I also want to give a sort of warning, I suppose, that here in Europe, we often forget that there are other things happening in other territories, and it's worth looking at this story in other places of the world too. But the other thing to say here is that very smooth and beautiful path that takes you to net zero is not the one I expect that we'll follow. And actually, I think the messiness of the transition is something we should embrace, especially if we hurtle towards electrification as being a core strategy. So let me try and understand and unpack that a bit more for you this morning. So I want to introduce a concept to you this morning that I've been talking about a bit more over the last year or so, which is the concept of electrostates. So we talk a lot about petrostates, and petrostates have, of course, a hugely important role to play in defining our politics right now and defining geopolitics for that matter. My view is that electrostates, which I'll define in a minute, will have a similarly big impact and are already having that impact in a way that is not surfacing in the public discussion as much as it should be. I think electrostates are generally trying to do something quite remarkable and are having success on it, and that we should want to copy that. So let me explain a bit more what I mean by that. So electrostates do two things. They are countries that embrace renewables, which are often very cheap, particularly in the sunbelt regions of the world because of solar. They do a second thing, though, which is not just roll out renewables. We often stop at that point in their discussion of it. They also embrace electrified technologies at scale. And we are seeing a collection of countries across the world that are doing that now at a pace that I don't know that we've paid enough attention to. So let me just explain how that looks from my perspective. And we'll start with a story where I feel the UK has something good to offer, which is the story of our renewable deployment. And you can see here for those of you who are far away from the screen, each of these colored bars shows a different year. So 2000 in the dark blue, red is the latest assessment. So this is electricity generated by renewables in the UK. You can see how that has grown remarkably over the past 20 years or so. That is in particular in recent years been driven by our deployment of offshore wind, which is something that we've gone from nowhere on that story to being probably the second biggest market after China for offshore wind now in the world. It's a remarkable story, but it's not the only place that you see that playing out. So note the change of scale here. So across the EU, we also see that rollout of renewables happening. But look to the end of this chart and you see China. And remember the scale of China. It is staggering what is happening in China at the moment. To give you a sense of that, last year, wind and solar deployed in China alone was greater than the rest of the world combined. So they are rolling out renewables at a pace that is really off the charts. And they are producing the technologies by and large that they are rolling out. And they also, of course, have a policy, very successful policy of progressively rolling those technologies out to other parts of the world too, including where we are today. So that's the kind of first story is to say, look, that is happening, but it is not happening here as quickly as it is in China and particularly in the Asian economies. If you look at the world, driven by China, but not just China, similar story playing out now. Our pace of rollout, as you can probably see in the EU chart there, is now behind the world. So the rest of the world is deploying renewables more quickly than we are here in Europe. So that is the first thing to point out. I just put onto that the share of electricity generated, and that's something we'll talk about. Across the world, there's about a third of electricity, a third of the percentage of total electricity generated at the moment is coming from renewables, but it will very quickly be a half. China is slightly higher than that, 34%. In the UK, we've reached half, so we're motoring towards a much higher penetration of renewables. Europe, about 42%. But it's the pace of it going forward that matters. So the first half of the transition is always the easiest one. The second half with renewables alone is often very difficult. And we'll come on to how we approach that in the UK in a second. But those electrostates are firstly the ones rolling out renewables quickly. You can see some of them on there. Secondly, looking at the question of what that looks like for the UK, this is what you see as you kind of roll that forward. So in the UK, our penetration of renewables has largely been driven by the fact that we've now squeezed coal off the system. And that is basically what we're seeing rolling out, including in Ireland, of course. The challenge of growing it further gets more interesting as we go into it. And I'll come on to that in a second. The part one renewables. Part two, the bit that we often forget, is the share of electricity that we're consuming in final energy consumption. That is basically the extent of electrification that we see in the economy as a whole. And across the EU and the United States, UK too, we see that the share of electricity in final energy consumption is largely plateaued around 20%. Ireland's story is a very interesting one. I haven't got the chart for Ireland, but of course it's grown recently, but that is data center demand that is driving it. If you take data centers out of it, really interesting to see it's still plateaued at around 20%. So we are not progressing. The last 20 years, we haven't changed at all on that metric. Now let's look at some other parts of the world. Norway has always been the sort of poster boy for this because they've got a much more electrified economy, always have. They are also plateauing, however, at 45%. Now we see the interesting ones. So India, really interesting place to watch. China, absolutely stonking rollout of electrified technologies. So they are replacing their fossil demand with electrified demand, and they are growing, they're meeting their future energy demands increasingly with electricity and electrified technologies. And they're doing so at a pace that completely outstrips us here in the West. And again, they are also the makers of the technologies that sit behind that. And just to put the global position on there too, interestingly, the world's electrification has now reached largely the place that we are here in the EU and across Europe. This, I think, is more important than the renewables story now. Because as we roll these technologies out, they increasingly displace the fossil technologies. That's how we'll win the argument ultimately on global transition. But each economy that replaces fossil demand with electrified demand is also becoming much more productive and competitive. That is why China is pursuing that strategy so hard, because they are not wasting as much energy. So classic example of a fossil technology is your car, your petrol car. You turn that on, it loses probably 2/3 of the energy in that car through heat. You don't get that with an electric vehicle. And that is true of all the electrified technologies that we see deployed on the system. So we should look at this chart, particularly the Chinese chart, and we should be concerned, I suppose, about what that might mean as we progress into the future about the productive capacity of China and its competitiveness in the global markets. Because every year that passes that China and the Asian economies roll out these electrified technologies is a year where they will become more and more competitive across their whole economy and not just on these more narrow issues of climate. So that, to me, is one of the main reasons why we should be paying attention and moving more to a strategy of electrification and more quickly. Just to give you a bit of climate optimism, if I can, on this, this is looking at the global path to net zero. So this is work that was done by the IEA. And what we require to get to net zero is actually only a 4% per year increase in electricity as a share of final demand. And you'll see that playing out in China to a far higher degree. And the Asian economies actually are a much higher economy than that, a much higher rate of deployment than that. So there is every chance that we can get ourselves onto the right global pathway to net zero, but it is largely about this issue of electrification. So can we move more quickly towards a more electrified demand profile? And you can see there buildings, industry, and transport, and the kind of trajectory that the world would need to follow to get onto that. I think that's perfectly achievable. So we should feel optimistic about that. But we should also worry about the fact that our own trajectory here in Europe is not looking like that. So what do we do about it? Well, question, could we in the UK join that club? So just a collection of metrics that we think matter for that, collected by my colleagues in the Climate Change Committee. So the story you see, again, apologies if you're at the back of the room there, but this is the key set of metrics that we think will matter for electrification into the future. And this is looking largely at the cost of the critical technologies for the renewables story and the electrification story. You can see in the dark sections on the left there, the historical position over the last 20 years or so, and you see these stunning price falls, absolutely stunning falls in the cost of offshore wind, solar particularly, batteries, and with it, battery electric cars. Just stunning how quickly they have plummeted in price. That is not because of climate action, it is largely because of the technology development that is happening, not just in China, across the world, but particularly China recently has been driving that. And the path that we think we need to follow into the future, you'll note that those lines are quite flat. So we're at a position where we think it is now possible for us to adopt these technologies at a price that the consumer will benefit from. But let me just add another couple to that to bring in maybe more of the political discussion, that at the moment, the biggest challenge is not the cost of the critical technologies. It is that the ratio of electricity prices to fossil prices is in the wrong place. So we're asking consumers to adopt a set of technologies that actually create a penalty for them at the moment, with the possible exception of electric cars. So electric cars today, if you buy one, the running cost of that over its life is probably less now than a petrol car. This needs to be the central challenge for our politicians back in the UK. I suggest it's probably true here in Ireland as well, that we bring down particularly the electricity price. Bringing down the electricity price, which we think is possible, will have this huge incentive to adopt these electrified technologies at a far faster pace and will allow us to compete again on the global market. So that is absolutely essential. And just to say something that, we think about consumption, we often think about households, but 2/3 of electricity consumption is commercial and industrial. So the big story there is actually probably in that bit of it. And I've shown the industrial prices here. That is where in the UK we've focused most in the recent 18 months or so in policy. We will see next year with the set policies that we roll them out, that we're going to bring down the industrial cost of electricity to something we hope will be approaching the US price with a set of rebates that are for the heavy industrial users of electricity. So that's something we've got in play. You'll see the impacts of that over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. So look, this clean power thing, and just coming to the sort of close of this conversation, I wanted to explain to you some of the international backdrop to that, and our role, I think, is to push on with this clean power thing. So the government came in 18 months ago in UK, in Westminster, with a very clear pledge to clean up the power system by 2030. I'm very proud to lead that. And what does that mean for us? Well, let me just explain that to you now. So this is another version of the chart I showed you earlier. There's a share of electricity generated in the last available year that we have. And what you see on this chart, again, if you can't see the text on it, apologies, but the grey part of this box, this chart is gas. It's about 30% of the total mix in 2024. Gas is hugely important to the electricity system in the UK. It is what provides the flexibility that allows us to accommodate all that green stuff that you can also see on the chart there. The green stuff is wind. And the flexibility that comes with gas is what permits that to happen. My view coming into this job is that rather than pretend that we're going to squeeze all that gas off the system, we should try and make use of it. So the central role of gas in our strategy for 2030 and beyond is not to close gas, but to run it less. So the idea is that we use gas's flexibility to reduce the running hours of gas to accommodate more and more of the clean stuff. And we think we have a gas system that will permit that. You might also notice nuclear on the mix there. And it's always a topical discussion of nuclear. Nuclear, we have plans to have new nuclear in the UK, but they come into the middle of the 2030s mostly. So nuclear is not a core part of our 2030 strategy because new nuclear is not something that we'll see on the system before 2030. So largely what we're doing is trying to accommodate more and more of the clean stuff into 2030 to get ourselves down to something that we think could reach in the 90 to 95% clean region by 2030. And we think that's a pragmatic take on how to do clean power. Just to give you a sense of what that looks like, and for the geeks in the room, the nerds in the room, this is a good chart. But current generation on the left there, we asked our energy system operator in Britain, NESO, to give us advice on what the 2030 power system could look like. And they gave us two scenarios last year. You can see there in the middle. They called it further flex and new dispatch. New dispatch is essentially having one or two power stations somewhere in the country that can act a bit like a gas-fired power station, but without the emissions. So either through hydrogen to power or by having gas with carbon capture. That makes a very big difference. If you have that on the system, it means you need to go less hard on offshore wind. And we are basically pursuing a strategy that looks very similar to NESO's new dispatch scenario there. And that final column is largely what my organization, DESNZ, is pursuing right now. We call it the CP 2030 range. But you will see on that the output that we are expecting by 2030 in the electricity system, which is dominated by the green stuff. So we move from where we are in 2024 with a great deal of gas dominating the mix to 2030, where gas is down to somewhere in the region of 5 to 10% of the total mix. If we can get it to 95% clean, that is our goal. That happens because of particularly offshore wind, so as you can see in the dark green there, but also some onshore wind, lots of solar in there too. So just to unpack that a bit more, this very dry table is probably the most important thing that we've produced in the last 18 months. So that range that you see on the right of this chart is what we are stretching for in Britain across each of these key technologies in that clean power system. So we've set a range that is at the top end of ambition based on that system analysis that I've just shown you, but also based crucially on an analysis of the pipeline of projects that we know is being developed in Britain today. And our goal is to try and get to somewhere in the middle of those ranges if we can, in the knowledge that if we fall short, we won't regret it because we'll need even more of this stuff past 2030. And the really interesting thing is to, well, of course, to set out a national target like that. We also knew that that wasn't going to be enough. So we turned those national goals that you see on the right there into a regional set of goals for the same technologies. And we have done what is, I think, the most radical thing that we will probably do at all in this parliamentary administration, which is to use those regional goals for each of these technologies to reorder the queue of projects that is waiting to connect to the grid. So we have a connection queue in common with Ireland and many other countries that is first come, first serve. So today we could come up with a good project and join that connection queue, and we'd wait behind everyone else that got in before us. For us, moving quickly in 2030, what we want to do is bring the projects that we know are most strategically aligned with these numbers to the front of that queue. And we also want those projects that we put at the front of the queue to be the most commercially ready. So the sort of secret sauce of what we're trying to do right now on 2030 is reorder that queue and build the pace through that route. So at the moment, we are days away from that queue being reformed. So that will then result in a new set of connection offers for those 2030 projects across the country that achieve these numbers. And that is tremendous from my perspective. We had to put a bit of legislation in place to allow that to happen, because essentially we're breaking private law contracts to reorder that queue. That is something that no other country is doing at the moment, but I know that there's a lot of interest in what we're doing. I think it will be a very successful process. It is incredibly hard. So we've chewed through thousands of connection offers to make that possible. And reordering the queue doesn't mean you lose your slot in the queue. It just means you get pushed back. So it's no one loses their connection queue, but some will be moved back in time. That is how we move quickly on this story overall. The reason that matters is because of this stuff. So this is the reason it's important for us to act with pace at the moment is because at the moment we're in a period where we're actually quite benign conditions for us to bring new generation onto the system. We think the central assessment of my department is that the demand for electricity will not increase very much at all by 2030. After 2030, really interesting. Oh, beg your pardon, I'll get to that second. But at the moment, the pre-2030 position is that demand we don't think will change very much, with the one exception of this box here. So this is non-domestic demand. Now, this is the most uncertain thing for us because in that box somewhere is data centers. And Ireland, you're way ahead of us on this. So we have seen already, and we watch with a great interest how Ireland has coped with this new electrical demand that comes from data centers. The next wave of that we feel is coming across to us at the moment. So my own view is slightly different from the department's, that small increase in non-domestic electricity demand is likely to be a lot bigger. And we want to kind of get ahead of that as much as possible with the stuff that I've just talked about. The bigger reason to do all this now is because of this bit, which is the post-2030 electricity demand. And the reason why we think it's probably sensible to do a bit of overbuild of clean generation now is because after 2030, possibly even before it, but after 2030, we see an explosion in electricity demand. And that is because of this story of electrification that I began my talk with you this morning. I don't know when that will come, but I know it is going to come. And the chances probably is that it will come quickly. So we want to have a power system that is ready for that before it comes. We expect, in line with the climate targets that we've set, that we will see electrical demand double by 2050. So double the size of the power system by 2050. We need to be prepared for that. So that is partly about building that generation that I spoke about. It is also, though, building more grid. And that is the other big challenge that sits behind this. I've talked about reordering the connection queue to the grid. The grid itself is not ready for that. So the other thing that we've done, along with the generation and the storage priority, is say that we need to put our arms around and give our support to a historic generation, really genuinely historic grid build program, the likes of which we haven't really seen since the 1950s. That gives you a sense of it here. So the red line that you see on this chart is the kick up in transmission length that we need to achieve by 2030 to facilitate all of that generation and storage to be connected. We think that's possible. It is at the moment coming to fruition. In the same time as we're doing the connection reforms, our energy regulator, Ofgem, is signing off on the plans for each of the 3 transmission owners that we have in Britain, Scottish Power, SSE and National Grid, to build that transmission system to that degree. It will be a huge challenge to bring it in by 2030, but that is the challenge that they've all accepted. For those of you paying attention to it, you might have seen that SSE produced their strategy that set out just that yesterday. Saw their share price go up by 10%. So it's a hugely important moment for us to green light this program. In that red line, though, are some of the most difficult political issues for us and for those companies, because we'll be bringing transmission through parts of the country where presently there is no infrastructure at all. It is largely to facilitate a change in the grid from one that was built around coal to one that is built around offshore wind. So think of the grid as we're kind of turning it inside out, essentially, to facilitate that. But it is amazingly exciting to see that program come together. As we talk today, I'm very excited about it because I think the supply chain constraints have largely been dealt with now. Each of those 3 TOs have largely finished their procurement processes and they've got suppliers. So I think we will now move really quickly on this as we move into the next year. And then the last part to this story is that we've done generation storage, we've done grid. We also need flex. So as we move into the next period, we need to be thinking more and more about the flexibility that we have, particularly on the demand side. So I'm showing you one assessment of where that might come. This is looking at demand flex at peak, and bringing that peak down basically allows you to have a cheaper system. The colors in this chart, again, don't worry if you can't see the numbers. Most of the flex that we think we will have in the system is going to come primarily from transport in the coming 5 years. So that's more and more electric vehicles. As we progress into the 2030s, hopefully, more and more of that flex will come from industrial electricity and heat. But we will not see most of that pre-2030 unless that electrification happens more quickly. So for the time being, the story on electric vehicles is really important to us. As we roll out electric vehicles, which is happening largely on the pace it needs to hit the targets that we've set, we need to build in the idea that those vehicles can be charged flexibly. And really interesting wedge on this chart, V2G, which is vehicle to grid. I think that's going to play an even bigger role in the future. That's basically where you've got two-way charging, and the car is actually providing some energy potentially back to that grid when it requires it. If we can have more of that in the system, it does look like that's coming. That will be tremendous for us in the future energy system as we build this out. That's very exciting. And this is the sort of gap between where I think we need to be on the consumer-led flex, as we call it, today, and where we need to be in 2030. And I show this chart quite deliberately because it's a big gap, but I also think it's a very exciting gap. So the story on the consumer side is going to be partly determined by the policies that we roll out to bring the electricity price down, but also crucially by this stuff. The more that we can build in the opportunity for consumers to flex and take the opportunity of cheaper power when it's available, the more successful this transition is going to be. So my goal is to try and fill the gap that you see there between where we think we need to be by 2030 and where we are today, with as much of that kind of opportunity building stuff as we can. And it's very exciting to see that roll out because it's driven partly by technology, but mainly by a set of consumers that are very switched on and want to do it. My point earlier, 2/3 of that consumption is commercial. They are often the people who are most responsive to the need for flex. So that's what we're trying to do. And very final point, and I promise I will stop talking now, but how fast can we go in this? Well, we always underestimate how fast we can go. And I think it's really exciting to have the British government focus on this in the way that we have. We're seeing now the response from the private sector, those investors that will deliver that. They have been tremendously excited, I suppose you could say, by the fact that we've made it so clear we want to do this. No doubt there are obstacles in the way and things that we'll stumble over, but so far, the first 18 months of us focusing on this has been tremendous. And, I would really strongly support everyone having a go at something like this, because this idea of mission-led government is something that can really work. How fast can we go? Well, look, there's a lot of misery out there right now about how fast we can go in the global transition. So I thought I'd come back to the story of the global transition just to give a little bit of optimism. And we talked a little downstairs, Alex, about this earlier. One of the reasons why I think we are going to succeed on this transition is because of this issue of investment. And they're showing you here just global energy investments. This is some stuff from the IIEA, again, from last year. Global energy investment flows, clean versus fossil. So fossil in grey, the green stuff is the clean stuff. The switch happened in 2016. And it's a story that is not often known, but in 2016, we saw for the first time that investment into the clean stuff was more than the dirty stuff. And you can see the final year there and what's making that up. That is an inexorable story now. It is playing out more and more, with greater and greater pace. And the mistake is to think that it isn't happening and to try and King Canute style prevent the waves from coming in. I think we should embrace this stuff, run towards it, because of course it helps the climate, but more importantly, it helps with our competitiveness as an economy. And our future role in that global economy is going to be determined by the pace at which we adopt this stuff. We should feel excited about it and we should run towards it. And final chart for me, I know I've shown you a lot of charts, but I said that that earlier chart was the most important one. In the end, this is the one that's been the most important chart to me personally over the time I've worked on climate. The reason we have to do this is partly, of course, because the economics support it, but mainly because of this chart. This is the global atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, which you get from the bubbles that are stored in ice in the poles. So if you look at those bubbles, you will see this story of history playing out and that natural carbon cycle playing out. In that red box is what we've done since we started burning fossil fuels. And if you can see the dates on it, it has moved incredibly quickly over the last 40, 50 years to the point where we are today. We should worry about this, but we should also use it, I think, as a spur to go more quickly on the story I've been trying to tell you about today, and particularly this story of electrification, because it is the way in which we will arrest that increase in that CO2 concentration and stop and end the continuing problem of climate change, something I think in this room at least we all want to see. So thank you.
I don't know what you thought, but I found that immensely interesting, informative, and with a very high measure of optimism and positive thinking. So that I know that, you know, the term excited is a little bit overused in social media and everywhere, but you mentioned it a few times. I think you're justified in saying that this is an exciting, the prospects that you've spoken about really are really very exciting. And thank you for, I mean, you're uniquely able to communicate this material, which is not without complexity, in a way that is, for me anyway, absorbable in just a short half an hour or so. So it's brilliant. I know people have questions. I have questions, but I'm not going to indulge my role here by going first. So who would like to ask questions? Let me see your hands. One there, 2 or 3 around the room. If you're watching us online, pitch your question in and we'll certainly get it. I'll go to the ambassador first here.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And I would agree, this is also gives us hope it's possible. And if we do the right thing, we can really get where we want to go. And thank you also for mentioning Norway. I'm Aslak Brun, the Norwegian ambassador. You know, we don't really get our own shot very often in presentations like this. So thanks for that. Of course, we are really big part of Europe's energy security. 1/3 of all gas to Europe is Norwegian now, and quite a substantial part of it also comes to Ireland through Scotland. And hopefully also in the future we can also export offshore wind from Norway to the rest of Europe, which would be really, really good, because the weather systems in Norway and in the Netherlands and Ireland are different. So if it's blowing, if it's not blowing in Norway, it's probably blowing here, or vice versa. But I would like to ask you a question about, you know, the pathway towards what we in Norway now call climate neutrality, which you call it net zero. When we're getting a bit further on to 2050. We know, and you showed it very clearly, that gas will probably be a part of the energy mix for a long time, for the reasons you explained. Ideally, we should then make that gas climate neutral. And the way to do it is carbon capture, use, and storage. We are experimenting. We have pilot projects now for cement production, for waste management. And UK, you are also, like ourselves, trying to see how can we store it safely at the seabed. Could you say something about how you see CCUS as part of the solution going
Chris,
forward?
I'm going to ask you to hold.
I will.
Keep that, because I'm going to group a couple together, given the time. John, please. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course, I'll write it down.
John Fitzgerald, fabulous presentation. I hope your slides are available, that you copyrighted them, because they're great.
Yeah.
My question is, huge investment needed. And you mentioned that electricity prices are too high and they need to be lower, in particular for industry to get take up. What's the cost of this? Who pays? How much of this will be paid by the users of energy, and how much by the UK taxpayer? Does the budget next week have to take this into account?
Maybe do those two.
Yeah, so we do carbon capture. So, I mean, carbon capture, we agree, is part of the mix. And then again, if you take that outlook I talked about earlier of standing in 2050 and looking back, you really see the role of carbon capture, because there's only so far you can go with the electrification story, and there's only so much that you can expect of nature. And there will need to be some engineered carbon capture and greenhouse gas removals in the mix. And for us in the UK, we're, I think, slightly ahead of Norway in the sense that we faced the closure of infrastructure at an earlier time than Norway does. So actually, lots of what we've been doing in the UK is moving more quickly to carbon capture to ensure that the infrastructure is there to allow the carbon to go to where it needs to be stored. So the last spending review, which was just this year, I mean, the past 18 months for me has felt like a decade. So, but so for it feels like an age ago now, but it facilitates carbon capture finally in the UK and on at least a couple of sites, and we have ambitions to go further. The question what we do with the carbon capture is another interesting one. So having some of that CCS in the power sector is very useful to us because it allows us to bring through what we call clean dispatchable power. But we also know that actually most of it we want to use in industry. So we've got really important industrial clusters that will use carbon capture on a single site, and that's very exciting. But really important thing to say, because I know there's a lot of skepticism about CCS, is that it's not a replacement for the other parts of the strategy. So we're going at full pelt on electrification and allowing CCS to be developed so that it can deal with the rump of 10 to 20% of emissions at the end of that. Every country in the world will face that challenge, and it is that 2050 outlook that keeps that in play. And it can feel strange to do something like that because it looks very expensive, but we know that in 2050 it's going to be something you wish you had. So that is our outlook on it, and I'm very happy to see supporting that in the spending review.
Super.
On the critical question, the cost of all this, it is the critical question. There's no question about it. So although we are aiming for clean power by 2030, we want to do so in a way that benefits the consumer. It's really interesting. Like the Financial Times does this chart every 6 months or so, looking at the cost of electricity, and shows Ireland and the UK as being the most expensive places in the world to consume it. I often feel that chart's quite misleading because it doesn't take into account all the rebates that the industrial users get. But nonetheless, we should pay attention to that chart, and global investors pay attention to that chart. So it is our ambition to do something about it. Now, if you do nothing, there's a set of costs in that system that must be recovered somewhere. You've got a choice. It's either bill payer or taxpayer, and the other choice is, can you stretch some of those costs out so there's a lower in your cost? So obviously those are things that we're thinking about. But if you do nothing at all, really interesting, all the stuff that I showed you earlier, believe it or not, there's a longer presentation of that we could go into. But basically we're putting a load of new costs onto the electricity bill to facilitate all that investment. And it is historically huge investment. And we think probably 200 billion pounds of CapEx to deliver all the networks and generation and storage. That, of course, is added to the bill, but stretched out over many decades and recovered from the bill payer. What that facilitates is a lower wholesale price, so the price at which the suppliers buy. So that falls basically because you're bringing onto the system a load of zero marginal price renewables. Those two things largely net off. So everything that we do in addition to that to bring down the cost of the electricity bill is going to be really, really additive. So yes, it's very much in play for the next few weeks and months, but we are going to keep focused on this issue now because we've got this nice position where all that investment brings with it all the jobs and all the good stories that we want to tell and doesn't actually create pressure on bills. If we can go further with policy, we'll be able to change that ratio that I talked about of electricity to gas. That's really critical because the next stage of this has got to be about changing the demand for electricity itself. We want to increase the incentive to consume the stuff that we're producing. So watch this space.
Yep. Two nice questions from the Zoom audience. Anna Lawler, Central Bank of Ireland, asked, at what point in the UK's journey do you think electricity prices can decouple from gas prices, particularly at times of greatest electricity demand? And then the second one from Chris D'Souza of Curzon Consulting, looking at the demand flexibility gap, should that be driven by commercial incentives alone, or should there be more regulations?
Oh, these are great questions. So decoupling of gas. So very interesting. I'm probably breaking some sort of rule by telling you this, but we've had a lot of attention to the Prime Minister in this mission, which is fabulous. So quite early on, he came along, and this is literally his central question: why do we allow the gas price to set the electricity price? And could we decouple that? And basically, there's kind of two schools of thought, but what one could do about that. So at the moment, gas is often the marginal plant that you bring on, and therefore whatever the price of gas is largely determines the price of electricity. We could try and, great word this, bifurcate the two markets and have separately a gas market and a sort of green pot. And that's quite appealing. Or we could allow normal market economics to play out and simply put a load of green stuff on there. And that's largely the second strategy that we've followed. So we think we will displace gas And that the new clean stuff that we bring on will be under long-term contracts in the contract for difference system that we have, which should be at a good price. And increasingly that will displace the price setting role that gas plays. We think that will happen before 2030. So the sort of decoupling will happen because of the quantities of clean power that we're bringing onto the system. But really important to say, I mean, today, I don't know what it is, but in any one year at the moment, gas is setting the price maybe more than 90% of the time. Maybe by 2030 we'll go down to under a third of the time. So that gives you a sense of it. But gas is still a very important price setting factor. So we want to keep going with that. The things that will really matter in terms of the displacement of the gas are long duration energy storage. Now we're really into the tech, but that is something that you can call upon. At the moment, it's gas that we call upon when we need it, when the wind stops blowing. In the future, there'll be other ways to do that. And those technologies have therefore an outsized role, even if they're expensive, in displacing gas as price setting. So I'm very excited about very bog standard technologies like pump storage hydro, but I'm also even more excited about some of the newer technologies that allow you to store electricity at scale, like compressed air, liquid air, flow batteries, because if you've got them on the system, you will call on them before you go to the gas. And that will allow, I suspect gas will become more competitive even at a price because of the competing technologies that are there. So we'll have a nice story hopefully to tell about gas not being such a problem for the consumer in the future. Demand flex and how we close the gap. I am currently of the view that the market will deliver most of that gap, but we need to facilitate that with some clever regulation. The temptation in government is always to step in and put a policy around everything. So, let's create a new policy to drive demand flex at the consumer level. It's, I think, unlikely to be successful. The pioneering companies like Octopus at the moment are out there showing us that the consumer will respond to it if they're given the opportunity to consume a new sort of product. So I'm very optimistic about our ability to close that gap that I showed you. But it does also rest on a set of technologies that need to be rolled out, including smart meters, and much greater deployment of electric vehicles and clean heat, electrified heat. So if we can drive that through policy, then I suspect that the innovative market players will deliver the incentive.
Who's the gentleman there? Yep, yourself. We get the microphone to you.
Good morning, Chris. My name is John Walsh. I'm the research manager with ESB. And thanks for kind of calling out the electrification point, because I think it's something that's not spoken about enough. We obviously have to decarbonize electricity, but we also have to increase. We also have to increase the rate of electrification from 20-something, where we're a bit stuck at the moment, to 70-something or 87%. And to do that, I absolutely agree with the point John made about who bears the cost of making electricity more affordable. But there's also a hearts and minds question. So how do we bring society along, and maybe what's the role in policy and what's the role of government in, I guess, bringing people on this journey with them? Because as we need to increase that rate of electrification, we need to bring the broader society along on this journey. And certainly with the heat pump adoption percentages in Ireland, we're not seeing the changes we need to see. I think the UK is quite similar. Electric vehicles are gaining momentum, but certainly the electrification of heat has stalled for retrofits here. And I'm just wondering what's your thinking in that space, because it is a real critical area.
Shall I pick that one up? Thank you, John. Well, look, there's been a lot of geekery this morning, so let me just personally make a geek point. If all we do in this story of clean power is focus on the generation and perhaps the storage side, we create a very expensive system. If we're not seeing more and more consumption of the thing that's being produced, it's just going to get more and more expensive. And that's one of the criticisms that's leveled against us, is that we've overly focused on generation. The reason we did that was because we knew we didn't have time to allow that to pass. So getting more ambition into the generation side now was always the plan. But we have to now see, in terms of the overall calculation of this, you need more demand to mop that up, because otherwise the unit price gets very high. So the more demand we have on the system, and the more that demand is matched to the availability of the supply, the cheaper the overall unit price of electricity will get. So that's a big part of the story. The next stage of this needs to be much more in the UK about electrification. So driving the incentives there is something that we're very, very interested in. The key incentive is to bring down the cost of electricity. So if you do that, you create a much broader incentive for them, for people to take the cheap option of electric cars, electric heat, and also industrial users to move to electrified technologies. So obviously that's something we're thinking solidly about. But I think that is also key to the second to your fundamental question, which is how do you bring people with us? Well, look, I've spent actually most of my time thinking about that prior to doing this job, and I think most people don't want to be bothered by the stuff I've talked about this morning at all, right? So we need to make this as simple as possible for them. We need to create the set of incentives such that it's an obvious choice for them to move to electrified heat or electrified transport. And they don't need to hear me say that. It should just be an automatic choice. I think we're on the cusp of that with transport. So we have successfully progressed to a point that our Norwegian colleagues were at a long time ago, where it's just the normal choice now to move to electric cars. And we'll see that more and more. What's driven that is the round cost of it being cheaper and increasingly now the unit price coming down as well. My story on China, though, is really interesting here. The price of an electric car in China is now sub $10,000, and that is a mass market play. European manufacturers really struggle at that price point. So we're in kind of interesting world where the tendency of policymakers is now to try and hold that back, which is, of course, going to hold back the overall transition. So we're in a fascinating period now for the EV transition. But the overall story in the consumer is we cannot ask too much of them on this. There are some people who really do care about it, but at the moment in the UK, mostly if you're installing a heat pump, you're going to have a more expensive heating system at the end of that because of the price penalty in electricity. Now, if you've got a very efficient house, very energy efficient house, then that's not the case. But we need to make it even easier for this to be a mass market play. So at the moment, our answer to that is to try and subsidize the unit cost of a heat pump. That's having some impact. But it has a shelf life as a strategy because we cannot subsidize the installation of every single household's heat pump. So in the long run, this needs to move to being a more mass market play. And I suppose the crucial thing is when people go to the pub, they need to talk about it as a normal thing, right? It's not some, zealot fantasy of us getting to net zero. This is just a normal run-of-the-mill thing. And my assessment, looking at this, is that that's how you win the war. You don't stuff this stuff down people's throats, that you simply create more and more of an appealing prospect for us to move to these technologies. It is largely driven by technology. And if I have a criticism of my friends in the green movement, it's that we often present a lot of the things that need to be done as a requirement for sacrifice. And actually, I think the better way through this, and the reason I do the job is that I do now, is because I think there's another way of framing this, which the Americans would call abundance, which is simply that we're creating a kind of energy system where there won't be the same constraints that there are today, that we won't have the same concerns from the requirement to import things from parts of the world that we'd rather not. And the availability of cheap electricity is the kind of core to that. To me, it seems to me that we're in the period now where we can form that as a mass market offering.
Right. We're up on time. I have one. Is there any others? Any other offers? I have two. I have three. I have four. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take those four. But if you wouldn't mind, just do kind of quick 30-seconders or 1-minuters. That'd be great. Just in the interest of time, if that's okay. And I'll start over here with Dermot and then Tom.
I'll be quick as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. Dermot Torney, Dublin City University, and a member of the Just Transition Commission. Can I ask you on the equity dimension of the transition and how you're factoring in your vulnerable users and distributional consequences and so forth? And also, if you have time, I was intrigued by your comments around reordering the queue and the legislation around that and breaking private law contracts. If you can say a bit more about that, I'd be really interested to hear it.
I thought that was interesting as well. Yeah, Tom.
As a member of the IIEA, a lot of criticism of regulation generically across the spectrum. One only needs to mention reducing red tape. Can you say a bit about this lovely phrase, clever regulation?
Those two, and I want to just thank, while Keane is going down with the microphone, thank Bernice Doyle for her from Net Zero Energy Limited for her question on gas. But we won't go back to gas at this point. But she's some interesting observations there by way of a question. And Kieran Cuff asks, can you comment on the role of interconnectors in reducing electricity costs and decarbonising the grids? Kieran Cuff, the Green Party.
Yeah.
There are two down there.
Yeah, Sean Murphy, thanks very much for this. I work with ESB Public Affairs. You talked about consumers, but how are you thinking about the political system in GB and keeping this holding the course agenda come what may? I'm talking about cross-party and growing smaller parties that could be very influential in the next election.
I think there was another one there. Yeah.
Thank you. Dennis Duff from 18 for Zero. We're an advocate group for clean energy without ideological bias. I love the amount of times that you mentioned the word can and excited, and it's really good. When I think about Ireland, I understand that our electricity has twice as much gas. We're about 60% gas at the moment, so it's much worse than the UK. We've little chance of having any offshore wind by 2030. We're already stifling large energy demand. And we have an ideological bias against nuclear energy. When Alex was minister, he didn't have that, and it's now being overcome in SEAI and EirGrid and that. So they are studying it. So it's going to be much more difficult for us because we also can't expand the grid with the same thing that you have. So I'm coming back to the thing of confidence, and it's how much of your own money would you put on UK reaching clean power by 2030? And if you did have to put your own money on it, what year do you think you would reach the clean power target?
Okay, there's a lot in there now, so you could.
That was an easy one.
Yeah. You can pick and choose a little bit.
Look, I'll try and cover all that. So, Tom, no, let's start with Dermot, who was asking about vulnerable users. So, our core strategy, actually, if you look at the consumption of the stuff I've been talking about, is to try and drive some of the technologies and the benefits that presently rich people get to those who are not rich. So at the moment, if you're rich enough to have, the Tesla in the driveway and the electric charger and fully insulated house and some solar panels and a heat pump, you massively benefit from this transition already. So we want to try and turn some of that in. So the programs that we're rolling out, particularly on the housing side, are about trying to drive some of those technologies down to those who most need them and allow them to get the benefits of that. And that, to me, is also part of the story of how you write the story on how you write the story on public support for this, is that people want it. And generally, that's what you find is when you create these conditions. So we're doing that. And you asked about the queue. Like, it's an enormous program of work. It's definitely the most difficult thing that we've undertaken. So we set out our strategic ambitions in that table that you saw. We then turned that into, with the support of the energy system operator, a set of strategic goals for each region of the country. So basically onshore wind, solar, and batteries. And then we've used that as a strategic basis for NESO then to go into the connection queue and to reorder it. So we can see the projects that are best placed to deliver those outcomes. We also know something about those projects. We want to have projects that basically have planning consent in place already, and preferably ones that are ready to be financed at the front of the queue. So we've used those as the key conditions. And NESO has chewed through that stuff in the last calendar year. It's been tremendously difficult for them. So NESO are themselves a brand new public body. They're newly independent. They were once part of National Grid. They are our energy system operator. They are doing a wonderful job for us right now. Just to give you a sense of it, we think they will probably move back in the queue 500 gigawatts of generation, which is a clue that queue was rather too big in the first place. But that will leave 2030 aligned projects that will deliver those numbers that we saw on that table. Now, if there is some attrition or if there's some delay to those projects, I can probably live with some of that because, if some of them get connected in 2031 rather than 2030, we've done an enormous service to the country. The challenge, just to come to one thing I didn't talk about, is that we thought about everything on the generation side rather than on the demand side, and we now see as big a queue on the demand side. So we haven't got such a clear strategic basis to reorder that, but that's something we're thinking about right now. And the legislative protection for that has been provided by planning and infrastructure bill that's going through Westminster right now. It's almost at its final stage. So that gives us the cover that we need to do that. And it will be tricky for us when the new offers go out in the next few weeks. So smart regulation, Tom. I don't know that we have such a great story to say on this. I mean, we over-regulate, don't we? Because we want to do everything. Our hands are dirty with the amount of policy that we put around everything here. My point about a cheaper electricity price is that you can then take your hands off some of this stuff at that point. So that to me that needs to be our central, that's kind of North Star for this. The more that we can drive down the electricity price, the less we will have to interfere. And I think that is, and that's not, like some sort of libertarian instinct that I have in me. It's just that I think that is clearly a better way through this. And that is very much what you would hear from Ed Miliband if he was here right now too. That said, we're not at that point yet. So we're still very much trying to steer the ship ourselves. Kieran asked about interconnectors online. Yeah, that is another core part. I don't know if you saw on that table, there was an interconnector objective on there too. There isn't really an upper end to my ambition on interconnection by 2030. The more that we have is generally better. It allows us to import and export more freely. What holds us back actually is at present the arrangements for coupling the markets that we see with mainland Europe particularly. And we are hopeful that we can move more quickly on that in the next few months to connect those markets again post-Brexit. That will allow us to create, I think, a stronger signal for interconnection. But these are big projects that require a regulator on either side of the fence to agree. So we've got big plans for interconnectors, but a lot of them will come after 2030, if I'm honest. And political agenda. I mean, of course, I worry about the political agenda. I'm a civil servant, so I worry less about the political agenda than others. But my bigger worry is that the fracturing of the consensus around some of this is something I think I can easily talk about. And I feel strongly that the more that we can rebuild a positive story about this, the easier it will be to repair some of the wounds that come from that. It takes me to, I think, some of the things I was trying to talk to you about today. Although I am a climate guy, I very rarely talk about climate change now. It was an opportunity to do so today, but that's because I think people out there do care about climate, but they also want to see that there's a set of other things in play that will benefit them more directly than just an improvement in the overall climate. So all of the stuff we talked about today is in the framing that we normally give to it when I talk about it back home. It's about the jobs benefit that comes from that. It's about the industries that will be built around that. It's about the energy security that comes from it. It is also generally about us getting building again as a country. We've suffered in common with many in Europe with an inability to get infrastructure built. And part of the story that we want to tell the country is that we are righting the ship on that. So those are all very important parts of what needs to be done. And they're not driven firstly by the climate. My experience is when you bring people a story of something that they want to see and then tell them that it's also good for the climate, that sort of enhances the positive feeling that comes from that. So this idea of putting the climate objectives sort of secondary to something else is, I think, the way to win the argument actually is that yes, what we're doing is indeed good for the climate, but it is also good for you and your home. It's good for your children. It's good for your jobs in your area. It's good for the security of the country. It's good for the beauty of our landscape. It's good for nature. These are all really important arguments that I don't think have had as much attention as they should have done. Clean power by 2030. Well, if you define it the way I've defined it, I think we'll get there by 2030. So I kind of duty bound to say that, really. So that's a nice, easy question to round off on.
That's great. We were up on time. I was going to explore it by way of a question, but I won't. I'll just sort of a reflection, not particularly well thought through reflection to finish. Paddy Hayes, who's the Chief Executive of the ESB, our colleagues, sponsors for this morning's event, has been talking just yesterday in the papers this morning about infrastructure generally, and of course in particular about housing. And the central, I mean, the great imperative for all of us, I think, is the impact of climate change and all of what you've been talking about. But the central political imperative in Ireland for this government and any future government that one can see is housing.
Yeah.
And water and electricity, like these are critical to it, and the infrastructure is wanting in relation to it. And Paddy even uses the word emergency. He says emergency measures will need to be taken in terms of, and there's huge funding the ESB themselves are deploying, which is really with support of government, but vastly more will be needed. I mean, multi-billions. This is to address this housing issue. And what I was going to ask you about, but I suppose it's a little bit too late now, but if any quick thought is, and I'm interested in what you say about these not trade-offs, but not to see the climate agenda as something separate, that there can be, like, are there is there an additional challenge for the country having to expand general infrastructure like housing when we're also trying to decarbonize?
Yeah.
And or actually, could it even be a good time to talk about decarbonization?
No, I think it's that. It's that. So that is absolutely critical. So the one view of the growth, and we have a similar challenge. I'm probably not quite as extreme in the housing side, but we have similarly, we put a mission around that too. So we want to see a huge new program of house building in the UK. That some people frame that as a pressure.
Yeah.
But actually, if you buy my argument here, the bit that's missing from that story is more demand. We want more electricity demand to mop up all that lovely clean power that we'll be putting on the system. I think that's the way to think about it. So the more electricity demand that we have in the system, the more that we can use it. Actually, that's great for households. It's slightly different for data centers, which is sort of an extreme form of firm power demand that actually does stress the system. So that is a new, well, it's not a new challenge, but it's more of a challenge perhaps than we thought it was. But the housing stuff, like we'll have it all, thank you. But the bigger challenge politically, which this government has picked up, is that some of that infrastructure is going to be tricky to support because it goes through parts of the country that don't have it at the moment. And Prime Minister has been very clear that he's going to see this through. So these are all, important planning concerns, and we should allow the planning system to do its job. But we are, as a government, supportive of putting that infrastructure where it needs to go. And that is part of the story. And it's interesting to look back. I mentioned the 1950s, but when we did this in the 50s and 60s, we were very honest with the country about our need to build the grid in parts of the country that didn't have it. And I feel we get back to some of that, actually. There's some brilliant stuff. For a while, I used to trot out these adverts that I'd found from the 1950s and Country Life magazine. Which is a wonderful, amazing sort of captures the age sort of thing. And it's these beautifully presented full-page pictures of new pylons being placed by a sort of giant godly hand into a field somewhere. But the key thing is really honest with people about the fact that infrastructure was coming, but also really honest about the benefits that will come to those communities. It's about connecting the valleys. A lot of these adverts are about connecting the valleys to the electricity system. I think we need to do that again, right? We are going through a program of building infrastructure, which we will not see again after this period. It will bring huge benefits to the country. Those people are already connected to the grid, so there needs to be something else that we're bringing them. And I think it is this story of more electrified technologies, smarter technologies, improvements to lives that comes with that, and the jobs and the industries that go with it. And I think if we're in a period where we can be honest about that, then we'll be successful.
It's a great note to finish on. Thank you very much, Chris Stark. Show your applause. By way of applause.